It always started with a sound, not of thunder, but of steel. The Pacific air was never silent for long, even in the quiet hours before dawn when the ocean was still and the palms stood like sentinels against the horizon. We could feel it. That distant vibration, a hum, a pulse, the heartbeat of the war. It came from somewhere beyond the clouds, a faint promise or a threat, depending on which side of the sea you stood. For us, it was the sound of hope, the promise that someone up there still fought back. Yeah, we had seen enough fire to know that courage was not loud. It didn't shout or sing or ask for recognition. It moved quietly, in the shadow between fear and duty. The men who flew with the 8th Fighter Group understood that better than anyone. And among them was a man whose name would travel farther than any bullet, whose legend would cross oceans before he ever came home. Richard Bong was not built for war. He was a boy from Wisconsin who liked engines, who smiled too much to be a killer. But the Pacific had a way of remaking men. The heat, the loneliness, the endless blue horizon, it burned away what didn't belong. Out here, even the kindest souls learned to live with ghosts. They called him Dick Bong. To his friends, he was the man who never missed. To the Japanese, he became something else, a phantom, a nightmare they could never quite see coming. Every time their radar screens lit up, every time a flight of lightnings dove out of the sun, there was a chance he was there. And they hated him for that. Because war is not about hate, it's about fear, and few things frightened them more than a man who seemed untouchable. It began in the skies over New Guinea in 1943. The jungle below was a carpet of green death, rivers of mud, swarms of mosquitoes, and 1,000 unseen rifles pointed at the clouds. We fought a different kind of war there. Slow, suffocating, primitive. But above the canopy, the air war was pure chaos. The Japanese still held the advantage then. Agile Zeros that could twist through the air like knives. Pilots who had been fighting since China. Men who knew no fear. Our P-39s and P-40s had struggled. They were brave planes, but they were never meant for the kind of dance the Japanese demanded. We lost boys faster than we could name them. That's when the P-38 Lightning arrived, a twin-engine monster, fast, deadly, and strange. 2 tails, a central pod like something drawn by a madman. The Japanese called it 2 planes, 1 pilot. To us, it was salvation. And in that cockpit sat Bong. He was 23, soft-spoken, polite, almost shy. But once the engines roared, something inside him changed. The Lightning became his second skin. He flew it not as a machine, but as an instinct. His hands knew where to move before the thought even formed. Some pilots fought with calculation. Bong fought with feeling. It was art and murder combined. His first victory came like a whisper. No celebration, no cheers. Just a flicker of smoke in the distance and the realization that someone else wouldn't be going home. That was how it always started. 1 kill led to 2, 2 became 5, and soon he was an ace. But there was something different about Bong. He didn't chase glory, he hunted survival. Every mission was another chance to see his friends alive. Every flight, another day bought from death. By late 1943, the tide was turning. The Japanese were still fierce, still deadly, but the balance was shifting. American production, training, and tactics were catching up. Yet in the air over Weevuk, Rabaul, and the endless islands of that cursed sea, it still came down to men like Bong, individuals against the void. He was a tactician of instinct. Where others dove to escape, he climbed. Where they turned to fight, he vanished into the sun. His P-38's twin engines gave him power to rise where Zeros stalled. He'd strike from above, unleash a storm of 50 caliber rounds, and be gone before the enemy even turned. "Hit fast, hit hard, get out," he told his wingman. Simple words, but in war, simplicity is salvation. The Japanese couldn't believe one pilot was doing it. They'd claimed dozens of kills over a week, sometimes against unseen ghosts, because they couldn't accept that a single man could dismantle entire formations. Intelligence intercepts showed their confusion. They thought Bong was a code name for a squadron, or that the Americans had found a new trick, some machine that made one pilot look like many. But it wasn't machines. It was something older, the quiet madness of a man who refuses to die. In the mess tents they'd whisper his name, not out of envy, but awe. The younger pilots stared at him like a talisman. "If Bong's flying today," one said, "maybe we'll all make it back." But Bong never believed his own legend. He worried more about his friends, about the ones who didn't return. "You can't be lucky forever," he said once. One day, the odds find you. By the start of 1944, he had become the face of the air war in the Pacific. Newsreels called him America's ace of aces. Washington sent photographers. Hollywood sent offers. But Bong stayed where the fighting was. In the humid heat of the South Pacific, where the air smelled of oil and death. The more famous he became, the less comfortable he felt with it. The heroes, he said, are the ones who didn't come home. We were winning, yes, but the cost was carved into every island we took. New Guinea, Biak, Hollandia, places that meant nothing before the war, now soaked with blood and memory. Bong kept flying. Some men burned out, others broke down, but he seemed calm, maybe too calm. Some said he'd gone past fear, others thought he'd just learned to live with it. He wasn't reckless, he was deliberate. He studied his enemies like an artist studying colour, every manoeuvre, every mistake. He learned the timing of zero turns, the stall angles, the blind spots. When he attacked, it wasn't guesswork. It was choreography. The Japanese called their best pilots samurai of the sky. If that was true, Bong was the ghost they never saw coming. In December 1944, word spread that he had passed 35 victories. 35, more than any other American pilot in history. Japan's records didn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. One man they thought could not possibly do that much damage. They assumed propaganda, but they were wrong. Every kill was logged, every witness confirmed. He wasn't a story, he was a storm. But even storms burn out. Command pulled him from combat, ordered him home. He didn't want to go. There's still work to do, he said. But orders were orders. He was sent back to America. Parades, medals, smiles. He met General MacArthur. The newspapers called him invincible. But those who knew him saw the weight behind his grin. War never leaves you clean. When you've lived that long in the sky, the ground feels foreign. Bong struggled with peace. He missed the noise, the clarity, the single-minded purpose of combat. Stateside, the days were quiet. Too quiet. He married his sweetheart, built a home, tried to start over. But history wasn't done with him yet. By 1945, the war was closing in on Japan. The new jet age had begun, the P-80 shooting star. Bong volunteered to test it. He wanted to fly again, to feel the sky one last time. Maybe he thought the ghosts would be quieter up there. Maybe he just didn't know how to stop. On August 6, 1945, the world shifted. The Enola Gay lifted off toward Hiroshima. At the same hour, across California, Richard Bong took off for a test flight in his new jet. It was supposed to be routine, but something went wrong. Moments after takeoff, the engine failed. He ejected too late. His plane fell from the sky and exploded. America's greatest ace, gone in a heartbeat. As the mushroom cloud rose over Japan, another smoke column rose over Los Angeles. Two fires, worlds apart but linked forever. When the news reached the Pacific, men who had flown with him sat in silence. Some wept. Others just stared at the floor. He survived the war, one said quietly. The war just didn't survive him. Even the Japanese, years later, would remember. In pilot diaries recovered after the war, Bong's name appeared again and again, a symbol of fear and respect. They couldn't believe one man had done what he did. They still couldn't. And maybe that's the truth of it. That belief has nothing to do with fact. Some things are too human to be measured. He wasn't immortal. He wasn't untouchable. He was just a man who flew farther than anyone thought possible. And in the endless silence of the Pacific sky, where the clouds still carry echoes of those engines, you can almost hear him. A low hum, a steady heart. The sound of one man who refused to fall. There were nights when the ocean itself seemed to breathe. The air was thick with salt, sweat and smoke from the island fires that never quite went out. Even the stars looked tired. We had fought for every inch of the Pacific, coral by coral, tree by tree, and yet the horizon always seemed to stretch farther. For the men who flew, the war never ended when the engines stopped. The hum lingered in their bones, even in silence. When Bong's name first reached the Japanese, it came not through propaganda, but through confusion. Reports from air groups near Rabaul and Biwak described a strange twin-engine plane. Fast, deadly, impossible to catch. It could appear behind a formation before anyone saw it coming. Its bullets tore through cockpits like lightning. Pilots called it the two-headed devil, and they said it fought like 3 men at once. That was Bong's lightning. We intercepted fragments of their radio chatter later, snippets of panic in the static. 2 planes? No, 1. Impossible, white-nosed, fast, vanished in the sun. Never saw it coming. The Japanese High Command didn't believe their own reports. They thought the Americans had developed some kind of new tactic, a Phantom Squadron. They were right about the Phantom, just wrong about how many men it took. By mid-1944, Bong had become a symbol to both sides. To us, he was proof that courage could still outfly fear. To them, he was an omen that their sky no longer belonged to them. Yet Bong himself hated the fame. He never strutted, never gloated. When asked about his victories, he'd shrug. Just lucky, I guess. But there was no luck in what he did. There was only precision, and a kind of quiet fury that the war had forced upon him. The islands blurred together. Buna, Leh, Nadzab, Aitap. The heat was unbearable. Sweat stung the eyes before the plane even left the ground. Every takeoff felt like lifting out of a furnace. The smell of avgas, oil and gunmetal was permanent. Mechanics worked shirtless, burnt to the colour of copper. Pilots carried salt tablets like relics. The jungle rotted everything. Planes, equipment, men's minds. But in the air, above it all, was Bong, slicing through clouds like a hawk. His squadron learned to recognise the look on his face before a mission. Calm, detached, almost blank. War had stripped emotion from him. Not coldness, just focus. He flew for the man beside him, for the idea of getting them both home. Some called him lucky because his plane always came back. Check, but luck doesn't reload .50 caliber guns in the middle of a dive. Luck doesn't thread the space between tracer fire. Skill does. Madness. Clark does. One mission stood out among the rest. Late 1943, the Battle of Wewak. Intelligence had spotted a large Japanese formation inbound. Bombers escorted by fighters. Bong's squadron was scrambled. They climbed into a sky already heavy with heat haze. At 20,000 feet, the sun was blinding. The Japanese came in waves, twin-engine bombers flanked by Zeros. Bong was outnumbered at least 10 to 1. He didn't hesitate. He dove through them like a blade. The P-38 screamed as its twin Allisons roared to full power. His first burst tore the wing off a bomber. Before the debris hit the jungle, he was already climbing again, rolling inverted, dropping behind another target. 2 more fell. His wingman lost sight of him completely. Just contrails weaving through the blue, like an artist's signature written in smoke. When the fight was over, Bong had claimed 4 confirmed kills. The Japanese lost an entire squadron. Their own records described it simply. Attacked by unseen enemy. Heavy loss. No survivors. We learned something about Bong that day. He didn't hunt for kills, he hunted control. The moment chaos erupted, he thrived. His brain slowed the world down. Where others panicked, he saw geometry, angles, speed, light. He could predict where a plane would be before it arrived there. It wasn't superstition, it was intuition refined by hundreds of hours in the air. The kind you don't teach. The kind that burns out early. The Japanese eventually gave the P-38 a name, Ni Taisensha, meaning 2 fighters. To them, it was not a single aircraft but 2 machines bound together, impossible to defeat. Pilots began to break formation the moment they saw its silhouette. They didn't know Bong's name, not yet, but they knew the terror he represented. Morale wavered. Veteran pilots were dying faster than Japan could train replacements. The sky, once theirs, had turned against them. The Americans began to notice it too. After every raid, reports came back the same. Fewer Japanese interceptors, more desperate attacks. We were winning, yes, but every victory felt heavier. For Bong, the weight grew unbearable. After each mission, he'd walk the line of planes and stare at the empty revetments, the ones whose pilots didn't return. He'd light a cigarette, even though he rarely smoked, and watch the horizon. No words, just silence. War changes the way you measure life. For a Bong, it became numbers, rounds fired, missions flown, men lost, hours in the air. He started keeping notes, not of kills, but of the names of friends who'd gone missing. Some nights, the men would gather near the beach, drinking warm beer from rusted cans, talking about home. Bong would sit a little apart, smiling faintly, lost somewhere else. "You ever think about what it'll be like when it's over?" someone would ask. He'd shake his head. "If it ends, we'll just find another war." The enemy never slept. Even at night, Japanese planes prowled the edges of the dark. Their engines had a distinctive whine, higher pitched than ours. It was like listening to ghosts argue. Searchlights swept across the sky. Tracers climbed, curved, and fell into the sea. The war had turned the heavens into a slaughterhouse. But when Bong was up there, everything seemed almost still, like the air itself respected him. By 1944, he was no longer just a pilot, he was a myth. Newspapers called him the one-man Air Force. Commanders used his name to inspire new recruits. He hated it. "Nobody wins this thing alone," he'd say. But alone was exactly how he fought best. His technique defied manuals, attack from impossible angles, fire in short bursts, vanish before the counterattack. Japanese survivors spoke of a silver ghost that appeared out of sunlight, fired once and disappeared. It wasn't legend, it was training pushed to the edge of human capability. When you fight that long, the world narrows. The ground becomes irrelevant. Everything is measured in altitude, speed, and seconds. The smell of cordite replaces rain. Sleep becomes optional. Bong began losing weight, his face hollowed by exhaustion and malaria. Still he flew. The doctors begged him to rest. He refused. "They're still out there," I said. "If I stop, someone else takes my place." That was the logic of every hero who never planned to live forever. Sometimes the Japanese would send bait squadrons, a handful of fighters to lure the Americans into an ambush. Bong saw through it every time. He'd pretend to take the bait, climb out of range, and then dive from above on the ambushers themselves. He turned their traps into his advantage. It wasn't arrogance, it was pattern recognition. He knew the rhythm of their mistakes. After a while, it almost wasn't fair. There's one story that circulated even among the Japanese. During a dogfight near Shimbu Bay, a Zero tried to ram Bong's plane head-on. The two aircraft closed at more than 600 miles an hour. Bong didn't flinch. At the last instant, he rolled inverted, passing so close that the Zero's propeller shaved the paint from his tail. The Japanese pilot was so stunned he lost control and crashed. Bong barely mentioned it afterward. "Close call," he said. But to those who heard, it sounded more like myth than memory. The strangest part was how calm he seemed afterward. He never trembled, never celebrated. He'd climb out of the cockpit, pat the fuselage like a horse, and walk away. To him, the Lightning was alive, a partner, not a tool. He talked about it the way sailors talk about ships. "She knows what I'm thinking," he once said. Maybe he was right. Machines have a way of inheriting the souls of the men who mastered them. The Japanese couldn't understand it. Their own aces relied on agility, on maneuver, the graceful dance of aerial combat. Bong didn't dance. He struck. Swift, brutal, precise. To them, it broke every rule of air warfare. "He fights without honour," one Japanese pilot wrote in a recovered journal, "but with great skill." They didn't know that for Americans, survival was honour enough. Back home, his fame spread faster than the truth. Posters, interviews, radio broadcasts, the smiling face of America's greatest ace. Mothers pinned his photo to walls, children learned his name before they knew where the Pacific was. But Bong stayed humble. "I'm just a pilot," he said. "I got lucky." He knew luck was a myth. Every flight was a dice roll against the sky, and he'd already won more times than anyone deserved. In late 1944, he was ordered home again, a safety measure. The brass couldn't risk losing their hero. Bong protested. "There are still boys out there," he scared. They grounded him anyway. He'd done his duty. Officially 40 confirmed kills, unofficially maybe more. The Japanese still couldn't believe it. Their own records didn't match the losses. They assumed American exaggeration. But the wrecks told the story. When Bong boarded the transport back to the States, the war was still raging. He left behind a sky filled with smoke and silence. His squadron watched him go, unsure whether to envy or pity him. For them, the fight would go on. For Bong, a different kind of battle was waiting, one against peace itself. The Pacific faded beneath him, islands like scars, ocean like glass. He stared out the window as the sunlight caught the wing, turning it silver. The same silver that had haunted the Japanese for 2 years. Below, the jungle swallowed everything. Above, the sky stretched endless. Between the two, a man who had survived everything except himself. They say the war made heroes, but the truth is simpler. The war made survivors, and Bong was the best of them. For now. Home The word didn't sound the same after years of jungle rot and burnt fuel. The silence was louder there. Streets that once rang with laughter now felt too clean, too distant. The war was still raging thousands of miles away, but in small American towns flags fluttered in soft summer wind, and people talked about victory as if it were already written. To men like Bong, peace felt foreign, a language they no longer spoke. When he stepped off the transport plane in San Francisco, he was met by reporters before he even saw the horizon. Cameras flashed. Questions rained down. How does it feel to be America's greatest ace? Did you really shoot down 40 enemy aircraft? What was it like up there? Bong smiled politely. It was like any other job, he said. They thought he was being modest. He wasn't. For him, it really had become a job, one where mistakes cost lives, one where success left scars. He was sent on a victory tour. Parades in small towns, photographs with children, interviews that tried to make war sound clean. He shook hands, posed beside factory lines, smiled for magazines, but behind the smile was distance, a 1,000-yard stare that never quite faded. The crowds cheered him like a movie star, but Bong looked out over them and saw something missing: understanding. They could never know the smell of burning fuel, the taste of fear, the sound of a dying engine echoing through the sky. He missed the noise, he missed the purpose. Every day in the Pacific had been clear. Take off, fight, survive. Here everything was vague. The war was still going, but he was grounded. They gave him medals, the Medal of Honor from General MacArthur himself, and told him to rest. Rest was the one thing he couldn't do. His hands twitched when he heard an engine overhead. He dreamed of tracer lines and clouds painted with fire. The mind doesn't forget its patterns so easily. Back in Wisconsin, the snow fell in quiet drifts, the opposite of everything he'd known. He married Marge, the girl he'd written letters to between missions. She was warm and patient, a light in all that emptiness. They bought a small house. The papers called them the perfect couple, America's ace and his sweetheart. But behind the door, Bong wrestled with ghosts. The Pacific was never far away. Some mornings he'd wake before dawn, walk outside and stare at the sky as if waiting for an order that never came. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Japan was breaking. The Americans had taken the Marianas, then the Philippines. The B-29s were firebombing Tokyo. Japan's empire, once stretched across half the Pacific, was shrinking by the week. And still, they couldn't forget the man in the silver plane. Allied propaganda dropped leaflets boasting of Bong's record. Japanese pilots laughed at first. Then they saw the wreckage piling up. In intercepted transmission, some began to ask if he was still out there. The fear remained long after he'd gone home. By early 1945, the end was approaching. The Japanese command was desperate. Kamikazes filled the skies. Pilots barely trained turned into weapons of hopelessness. The American fleet bled but kept advancing. Each island taken brought the mainland closer. The logic of the war had become monstrous. Sacrifice everything until nothing remained. And yet, somewhere in that chaos, Bong watched from afar, grounded, restless. The Army Air Forces wanted to use him in stateside programs, war bond tours, morale visits, training. But Bong wanted to fly, not for glory, not for combat, but for the feeling. "If I'm in the air," he said once, "the world makes sense." When Lockheed introduced the new P-80 Shooting Star, America's first jet fighter, Bong volunteered immediately. The brass hesitated. He'd done enough, they said. Let someone else take the risk. But he insisted. Flying was the only thing that ever made him feel whole. They agreed, finally, and sent him to California for test flights. There, the desert air was dry and sharp, the sky endless. For the first time, he saw the future of flight, smooth, fast, different from the raw muscle of the lightning. The jet felt alien, stripped of vibration, more like gliding than fighting. "It's like being a ghost," he told Marge after his first flight. She smiled, not understanding how true that would become. Every pilot has a moment when the air betrays him. For Bong, it came on a quiet morning in August 1945. The war in the Pacific was nearly over. American bombers had already reduced much of Japan to ashes. Still, the final blow hadn't fallen. That morning, the sun rose over two worlds, one still burning overseas, one at peace in California. In the hangar, Bong prepped his P-80 for a routine acceptance flight. He checked the instruments, the fuel lines, the new jet engine that hummed with promise. There was no omen, no warning, just the sound of progress. Calm, confident, unstoppable. He climbed into the cockpit, ran through his checklist and took off. The shooting star leapt forward with power unlike anything he'd flown. It was smooth, almost eerie in its quiet. He lifted into the pale blue sky, banking east toward Burbank. Witnesses on the ground watched the silver shape glint in the sun, streaking across the horizon like the ghost of the lightning he'd once flown. Then, in a heartbeat, something went wrong. The engine flamed out. The jet lost power. Smoke trailed from its tail. At such speeds, there was no time for reflection. Bong tried to eject, but the seat mechanism jammed. The plane dropped low over the rooftops, clipped a building, and exploded in fire. It was over in seconds. The clock read 10:30 a.m., August 6, 1945. At almost the same moment, half a world away, another American aircraft, the Enola Gay, was climbing through the dawn above the Pacific, bound for Hiroshima. 2 flights, 2 fates, one ending the war, the other closing a chapter of it. The timing was uncanny, cruel, and perfect in its symmetry. America's greatest ace died the same day the war began to end. When the news reached his old squadron in the Pacific, no one spoke. Some thought it was a joke. "Not Bong," one said. "He doesn't die like that." But it was true. The man who had survived hundreds of missions, dozens of dogfights, malaria, and luck itself, was gone in a training accident. The universe has a dark sense of balance. Even the Japanese would later note the irony. In diaries recovered after the war, pilots wrote of the American ace who had haunted their skies, and how strange it felt to learn he had died in peace, not battle. One wrote simply, "The heavens took him." They never met him, but they knew his legend. Some refused to believe it at all. "No," another wrote, "the ghost still flies." Back home, Marge received the telegram while listening to the radio. The announcer spoke of Hiroshima. She barely heard it. Her world had already fallen silent. The headline the next morning was cruel in its juxtaposition. "Bong dies in crash. Atomic bomb dropped on Japan." One life extinguished as another inferno began. The war was closing its circle. At Bong's funeral, the flags were crisp, the speeches rehearsed. The general who pinned the medal on him months before stood again before the crowd, reading words of valor and sacrifice. But those who knew him felt something deeper, a kind of aching absence, because Bong had never sought glory. He'd sought meaning, and in the end, maybe he found it in the sky that took him. The Japanese war machine crumbled within weeks. Hiroshima, Nagasaki surrender. The same pilots who once feared Bong's P-30As now stepped out of their own cockpits for the last time. Some survived captivity, others vanished into the wreckage of empire. And yet, when interviewed years later, they remembered the name. Bong, the American ghost, the one they never believed was real. Time has a way of softening legends. But Bong's story didn't fade. His name was carved into museums, airfields, and textbooks. But his vague-call, that easy smile, that calm, carried a quiet that photographs couldn't capture. He wasn't larger than life. He was life at its most fragile, flying through a world built to destroy it. As historians looked back, they tried to measure his impact. 40 confirmed victories, hundreds of missions, morale that stretched across oceans. But numbers don't capture what mattered. His real legacy wasn't the planes he shot down, but the balance he brought to a war that had lost its humanity. In him, skill met humility, violence met grace, the very thing the Japanese couldn't believe, that one man could embody both killer and saviour, was exactly what made him unforgettable. The Pacific ended not with cheers, but with silence. The jungle grew back. The rusted wrecks sank beneath waves, and the sky, once filled with engines, became still again. Yet somewhere in that stillness a whisper remained, the faint echo of 2 engines beating in perfect unison, the song of a plane that refused to be forgotten. In Japan, long after surrender, school children would visit war memorials and see American planes displayed beside their own. The Zero and the Lightning, enemies frozen side by side. The guides would tell them of the battles, the tactics, the losses, and sometimes an older veteran, a grey-haired, quiet, would add a name, Bong, the one who flew like a spirit, the one they could never quite believe existed. For Americans, he became a symbol of what the war had taken and what it had preserved. Courage without cruelty, mastery without arrogance. The newspapers called him a hero. The men who'd flown beside him called him something simpler. Friend. Because in the end, that's what he had fought for. Not medals, not fame, just the man flying beside him, the hope that they'd both see another sunrise. The Pacific War was over. The world began to move on, but somewhere in the empty skies above those endless islands, the ghost of a lightning still flies, silent, silver, eternal. The Pacific became calm again, though calm in that part of the world never really meant peace. For months after surrender, the air still smelled of kerosene and burnt coral. The beaches were littered with rusting fuselages, their metal frames twisted into strange sculptures by heat and time. Seabirds nested where men had once died. Out in the shallows, sunlight glittered off shell casings like coins scattered by the tide. The war had ended, but the world hadn't yet learned what to do with the silence that followed. Men came home slowly, carrying pieces of the islands with them, sand in their boots, scars that never healed, dreams that bled into waking. Some found work again, some never really landed. The sky had been their truth, and everything else felt small. They'd stand outside grocery stores, watching clouds pass, and for an instant see tracer fire instead of sunlight. It was the price of coming home alive. Bong would have understood that better than anyone. In Wisconsin, they named a field after him, Bong Air Force Base. It stood for a few proud years before time and budgets folded it into memory. The town kept his story alive in museums and local parades, but the legend had softened. Children knew the name, not the man. The newspapers called him Our Richard, as if the boy who once farmed their fields had simply gone off and done something slightly larger than usual. The truth was harder to hold, that he had lived faster, burned brighter, and carried the weight of an empire's disbelief on his wings. And pilots who came after him flew jets that reached the edge of space. They chased speed records, broke sound barriers. Yet even in that new age, they spoke of Bong with a kind of reverence reserved for myths. In the ready rooms of Korea and later Vietnam, old instructors would point to his photograph and say, "That's what flying meant before the computers took over." They studied his combat notes, his diagrams of angles and sun positions, his tiny pencil marks showing where to strike. In every line was discipline born from desperation. He'd written it not to boast, but to help the next man survive. Far across the sea, Japan rebuilt from ashes. Cities rose where craters had been. The people who had once cursed his name found themselves standing in line for bread beside the very soldiers they had sent to die. The hatred drained away, replaced by fatigue. Veterans of the Imperial Navy sat in small bars near Yokohama, drinking quietly, talking about the past only when the bottle was nearly empty. Once in a while someone would mention the war in the air, the smell of oil, the blinding flash of sunlight off enemy wings, and always, inevitably, the question, "Do you remember the twin tail?" Heads would nod. The one they called Bong, they would shake their heads slowly, smiling as if speaking of a ghost story told to frightened children. "He flew like he wanted to disappear," one of them said. And perhaps that was true. The disbelief that once fueled their fear had turned into respect. When peace came, so did truth. They read Allied records, saw the photographs, learned that the two-headed devil had been only one man, calm and patient. Some wept quietly at the realization. In the code of the old samurai, respect for the worthy enemy was sacred. Even in defeat, honor demanded recognition. The man they had thought a myth had been painfully real. Years later, one of Bong's surviving wingmen visited Japan during an exchange program. He was grey now, his eyes clouded by age, but the moment he stepped onto the tarmac and felt that heavy Pacific air again, the years peeled away. Reporters asked him what it felt like to stand on the soil of his former enemy. He smiled faintly. "Feels like the same wind," he said. "They were all just trying to live through it." Then he paused, looked up at the sky and added, "Bong would have liked to see it this way." That was all. The Japanese papers quoted him the next day beside a small photograph of Bong's lightning, and for a brief moment, the ghost crossed oceans again. Time erases sound before it erases stories. The engine stopped, the wrecks rusted away, but the tales endured. Somewhere along the way, Bong's name stopped meaning numbers and started meaning something quieter, the measure of a man at the edge of fear. The older generation kept his photograph framed beside the folded flags of brothers and cousins who never returned. New pilots pinned his silhouette to lockers, not as an idol but as a reminder. That skill meant nothing without restraint, that courage without humility was just noise. Historians tried to dissect the legend. They traced missions, tallied enemy losses, cross-checked Japanese archives. They found the math impossible, the coincidence is staggering, and still the numbers stood. Even the skeptics, faced with the wreck reports, had to concede he had done the impossible, again and again. The Japanese hadn't been wrong to disbelieve. They had only underestimated what men can do when hope is all they have left. In the decades that followed, the Pacific changed shape. Tourism replaced trenches. Where once we saw wreckage, we built resorts. Divers swam through coral-coated bombers, touching the skeletons of machines that once ruled the air. Children chased waves across the same beaches that had once run red. The world forgot the sound of the engines, but sometimes, when the wind comes off the sea just right, there's a faint low hum, the ghost of a vibration that feels like memory itself. The locals say it's the planes returning home. The veterans say it's imagination. But the sky keeps whispering anyway. Every generation finds its own war, and every war creates its own ghosts. Ours flew on 2 engines and carried the weight of disbelief. We learned from him that heroism isn't loud, that sometimes the greatest victories are simply the ones that keep you breathing. The Japanese learned it too. They built monuments not only to their own fallen, but to the shared madness that had consumed us all. At one of those memorials tucked away near Okinawa, a small bronze plaque lists the names of American pilots lost nearby. Among them, someone engraved unofficially, maybe with a pocket knife, one extra word: Bong. No rank, no unit, no number. Just a name. The caretakers never removed it. If you stand there at dusk, the air heavy with salt, you can hear cicadas buzzing through the ruins. The light turns the sea gold. Somewhere beyond the horizon lies Wisconsin, and between the two, 10,000 miles of sky once filled with fire. You can almost see it if you close your eyes. The twin tails cutting through cloud, the flash of sun on metal, the moment when disbelief turns into awe. We tell these stories not to glorify war, but to remember what it cost. Bong's legend is not about how many he shot down, but about the quiet he carried inside him, the refusal to be consumed by hatred. In that sense, he defeated more than enemy pilots. He defeated the darkness that wanted to make killing the only purpose a man could know. That's why the Japanese couldn't believe it. Because he fought like a predator but lived like a poet. And in war, that combination doesn't make sense until you see it yourself. History will keep writing his name on the edge of footnotes and flight logs. Scholars will argue about the counts, the claims, the confirmation codes. But those of us who remember, or who listen to those who did, know that numbers were never the truth. The truth was the feeling of watching that silver shape rise into the sun, knowing that somewhere in that blinding light, a man was keeping the darkness at bay. The Pacific skies are quiet now. The clouds drift like ghosts over islands too small to find on most maps. Beneath them lies a history written in salt water and silence. We once filled that sky with fire. Now it belongs to the wind again. Yet if you listen closely, sometimes the horizon trembles, just a faint echo, the heartbeat of engines that no longer exist, the memory of a boy who became a legend. We never built another pilot quite like him. You can't manufacture balance or humility, or that strange peace a man finds when he finally accepts the sky. Richard Bong was the measure of all three. He left the world the way he lived in it, rising toward light, vanishing into air, part of something larger than himself. So when we speak of the Pacific, we speak softly. We remember the fear, the endless blue, the islands that ate men whole, and we remember the silver plain that taught us disbelief is only another word for wonder. The Japanese couldn't believe one man could do what he did. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps no single man could. Perhaps it was something larger, an idea carried on wings, a fragment of every hope that refused to burn away. In the end, all wars end the same way, with silence. The noise fades, the medals tarnish, the headlines dissolve, but somewhere out there, above the calm Pacific, 2 engines still hum in memory's thin air. They circle once, catch the sun, and fade into cloud. And for a moment, just a moment, the world feels weightless again. It always ends the way it began, with a sound, not of thunder, but of steel.